The uprising in Black Hollow had reached its breaking point. The sheriff, once a towering figure of fear, now looked small and cornered beneath the gaze of the townsfolk he had ruled for years. The mayor's son clutched his coat, sweat trickling down his face as if he too finally realized the truth that the walls of power, so carefully built on lies, were beginning to crack. Mara could hardly believe what she was witnessing. All her life she had walked unnoticed among these people, dismissed as a servant, a shadow. Yet now, when she spoke, the crowd shifted closer, hanging on her words. Elias stood beside her like a pillar, steady, unflinching. Though blind, he seemed to guide the entire square with the calm in his voice. The sheriff drew his pistol, his hand shaking. "Back off, all of you," he roared, "or I'll shoot." For a moment, the square fell into silence. Mothers shielded their children. Men clenched their fists. Fear coiled in the air again, threatening to choke the uprising before it could bloom. Elias raised his chin. His voice cut through the hush like a blade. "Go on then, shoot, but you cannot kill us all. And even if you kill me, you cannot kill the truth. It is already alive in them." The sheriff's face twisted with rage. He aimed at Elias, but before his finger could pull the trigger, a stone flew from the crowd, striking his arm. The pistol clattered to the cobblestones. A boy, no older than 12, stood with his chin raised defiantly, another stone in his hand. "Leave them alone." The boy shouted. The sheriff cursed and lunged for the weapon, but the townsfolk surged forward as one. Farmers, blacksmiths, cobblers, mothers, every hand that had been silenced for years now rose to push back. The sheriff was dragged down, his shouts muffled under the roar of the people. The mayor's son tried to flee, but Mara stepped into his path. Her body trembled, but she did not move aside. "You will not run from this," she said, her voice firm. Behind her, the crowd pressed closer, forcing him back into the center of the square. "No," he cried. "You don't understand. We kept order. You needed us." "Order?" Mara spat. "You fed on our suffering. You built your wealth on our silence. That is not order, it is theft." The blacksmith stepped forward then, his voice booming. "We decide what happens now," the crowd roared in agreement. Chains of fear that had held them for years had snapped, replaced by unity. The sheriff and the mayor's son were bound, their powers stripped away not by blades or laws, but by the courage of the people they had once crushed. Mara's heart pounded as she looked at the faces around her, faces that, for the first time, saw her. Not as a servant, not as a nobody, but as someone who had stood when no one else dared. Beside her, Elias laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. Though his sightless eyes could not witness the scene, his calm smile told her he already knew. "It has begun," he whispered. The lies have fallen. The square erupted into cheers, not wild, reckless celebration, but the raw, trembling relief of people who had reclaimed what was stolen from them. Neighbors embraced. Children laughed. Tears streaked weathered cheeks. For the first time in years, Black Hollow breathed free air. And in the center of it all stood Mara and Elias, the blind man and the forgotten girl, proof that even the weakest could rise. And that truth, once spoken, could topple even the mightiest. Morning came to Black Hollow unlike any the town had ever known. The air felt lighter, the silence less suffocating. For years, dawn had broken over streets weighed down with fear and secrets, but now the rising sun seemed to wash the cobblestones clean, painting the square in gold as if declaring a new beginning. The sheriff and the mayor's son had been locked away, guarded not by soldiers but by the very people they once oppressed. The townsfolk took turns keeping watch, farmers in the day, blacksmiths and cobblers at night, proof that they no longer needed corrupt leaders to keep order. The lies that had bound them had been shattered, and in their place stood unity. Mara walked through the streets that morning with hesitant steps. She half expected someone to laugh at her, to shove her aside as they once did. But instead, people smiled. The baker handed her a loaf of bread without asking for coin. A mother touched her arm softly and whispered, "Thank you." Even children who had once ignored her now ran past, calling her name with bright eyes. It felt unreal. She had spent her whole life as a shadow, and now the whole town seemed to see her at last. Elias, walking with his stick, moved slowly beside her. Though his eyes saw nothing, his face carried the peace of a man who knew his journey had not been in vain. "They speak your name with gratitude," he said quietly. "Do you hear it?" Mara swallowed hard. "I do, but it doesn't feel like me. I'm just Mara," he smiled faintly. "No, you're the voice that woke them." The girl who was a nobody became the heart of Black Hollow. Her throat tightened. She had never thought herself capable of such a thing. And yet, standing there, with the town no longer chained by fear, she began to believe. The rebuilding began quickly. Shops that had once been drained by the sheriff's taxes reopened their doors with fairer prices. Neighbors who had hidden from one another now worked side by side, mending broken fences, sharing supplies, and caring for those who had suffered most. Where suspicion had once ruled, trust began to bloom. At night, the square filled with lanterns and laughter instead of threats. Music returned, soft at first, then bolder, as if the town remembered how to breathe joy. And in every gathering, Mara and Elias stood side by side. She, the once invisible girl. He, the blind man who had seen deeper than anyone. Together, they were not rulers, not saviors, but reminders that truth belonged to everyone, even the forgotten. One evening, as the lantern swayed in the warm breeze, Mara turned to Elias. "Do you think this will last? Or will lies find their way back again?" He tilted his head, listening to the laughter in the square, the voices rising in unity. "Lies always return," he said softly. "But so does courage. And now they know they have it. That cannot be taken away." Mara looked out at the people, her people, now, and felt a swell of pride she had never known. For once, she belonged. For once, she was not nobody. Elias reached for her hand. She let him take it, her fingers trembling but sure. In his touch she found strength, and in his steadiness she found home. Black Hollow had been reborn, and so had they. The story of the blind man and the nobody became a whispered legend in the town, told not to glorify them, but to remind everyone that change had come not from power or wealth, but from truth and courage. And as the stars stretched across the sky that night, Mara finally lifted her face to them without fear. For the first time in her life, she felt not invisible. The powerful men of Black Hollow were growing restless. Whispers of betrayal clawed at their throats, and fear began to gnaw at the order they had ruled with for decades. Too many secrets had been slipping through the cracks. Too many of their private dealings had become the town's hushed gossip. It was only a matter of time before someone moved openly against them, and so they set a trap. The sheriff was the first to speak it aloud during a gathering behind the courthouse. "There's a rat in this town," he growled, his meaty hand tightening on a flask. "Someone's prying into things they shouldn't. Best to make an example before folks get brave," the mayor agreed. His eyes flicked to his son, who lounged carelessly in a chair, but whose smirk carried venom. "Not just anyone," the mayor muttered. "Whoever it is, they know too much. We draw them out, bait them, crush them in front of everyone." The bait would be Mara. She never saw it coming. To her, it was another night of eavesdropping, of listening where she was not meant to. A whisper reached her ears at the tavern talk of a shipment arriving late, guarded heavily near the mill. It seemed important, urgent. Exactly the kind of thread Elias had taught her to pull. So she went, slipping through the shadows as always. Her heart hammered, but her steps were sure. She thought she was unseen. She thought she was safe in her invisibility. But this time, they were waiting. A rough hand clamped around her wrist before she could react. Another grabbed her shoulder, shoving her into the open. Torches flared, and faces loomed out of the dark. The sheriff. The mayor's son. Several guards. Well, the sheriff sneered, his voice dripping satisfaction. Look what the rat dragged in. Mara's blood ran cold. She tried to twist free, but the men held her fast. Panic clawed at her chest. She had been careful. How had they known? They dragged her into the town square, where a small crowd gathered despite the late hour. People peeked from windows, whispering, their eyes wide. The sheriff shoved Mara onto the ground. Here's your ghost, he announced to the townsfolk. Just a servant girl who thought she was bigger than her station. Laughter rippled cruelly through the night. Mara's cheeks burned with shame. She wanted to vanish, to shrink into the cobblestones, but they would not let her. The mayor's son crouched beside her, his voice low and mocking. You thought no one saw you, didn't you? A nobody, sneaking around, listening where you shouldn't. Did you think you mattered? Tears pricked her eyes, but she bit them back. She would not give him the satisfaction. From the edge of the square, a voice cut through the noise. She matters more than you'll ever know. The crowd turned. Elias stood there, leaning on his stick, his sightless eyes fixed on the men in the center. The sheriff barked a laugh. You? A blind beggar? What do you plan to do? But Elias didn't flinch. He stepped forward, each tap of his stick steady as a heartbeat. You've built this town on fear, he said, his voice calm but carrying. But fear is brittle. It cracks when truth strikes it. The mayor's son scowled, motioning to the guards. Shut him up, yet for a moment no one moved. Perhaps it was the steadiness in his voice, or the way the townsfolk leaned in, listening as if a spell had been cast. In the silence, Mara felt something shift. Elias turned his pale gaze toward her. You are not invisible, Mara. Not to me. Not to them. Not anymore? Her heart twisted. Even in chains, even humiliated, he was reminding her of her worth. The trap had been sprung, but it was not finished. For in that moment, the people of Black Hollow began to see not just a servant girl, not just a blind stranger, but something far more dangerous. Courage. And courage, once seen, is impossible to forget. The square of Black Hollow was thick with silence after Elias's words. The sheriff's laughter still echoed faintly, but it no longer rang with confidence. The townsfolk, who had come expecting a spectacle, a girl mocked, punished, forgotten, found themselves staring instead at the blind man who stood tall and unafraid. His sightless eyes seemed to cut deeper than any gaze could. Mara, still on her knees in the dirt, felt the shift ripple through the crowd. People were leaning forward, listening, waiting. For once, she wasn't invisible. They were watching her. The sheriff recovered quickly, his face turning red with fury. Enough of this, he bellowed. This girl is nothing. A servant who overstepped. We'll teach her, and anyone like her, what happens when you bite the hand that feeds. But Elias lifted his walking stick and tapped it firmly against the stones. The sound rang sharp, like a gavel of judgment. No, he said simply. You do not feed them. You starve them. You bleed them dry while lining your own pockets. And you dare to call it order. A murmur spread through the crowd. Heads turned, whispers passing faster than wildfire. Some nodded, hesitantly at first. The butcher shifted uncomfortably, remembering his inflated prices. The blacksmith's wife bit her lip, recalling the night her husband had been fined unfairly. The mayor's son sneered, but his smirk wavered. You think these people will listen to a blind beggar? Elias tilted his head. They already are. Mara rose shakily to her feet. Her fear still coiled inside her like a serpent, but beside Elias's words, courage bloomed. She looked at the crowd, the very people who had ignored her all her life, and found her voice. You've all felt it, she said, her voice trembling at first, then steadying. The weight of their lies. The missing goods. The unfair taxes. The fear of speaking the truth because you might vanish in the night. You think you're alone, but you're not. We all carry the same chains. The murmurs grew louder. Farmers exchanged glances. Mothers clutched their children tighter. The truth had been spoken aloud, and there was no swallowing it back. The sheriff stepped forward, face twisted with rage. Enough, take them both. But as the guards moved, something unexpected happened. A man in the crowd, a thin cobbler with trembling hands, stepped forward. No, the sheriff froze. Then another voice rang out, this one stronger. She's right. We're tired of being bled dry. It was the blacksmith, his great arms crossed defiantly. One by one, voices joined. Not shouts, but firm declarations. No more. We've had enough. They speak truth. The sheriff barked for order, but the crowd no longer feared him. His own guards hesitated, shifting uneasily as the people they were meant to control pressed closer, braver with each heartbeat. Mara's chest tightened with disbelief. For so long, she had been unseen, unheard. Now her words lit a spark that no one could extinguish. Elias stood beside her, calm as stone, but she sensed the quiet pride in him. This town belongs to its people, Elias said, his voice carrying above the rising clamor. Not to thieves dressed as leaders. The uprising was not a sudden explosion, but a steady roar rising from the throats of the weary. The townsfolk surged forward, forcing the sheriff and the mayor's men back. Windows flew open as more people poured into the square. For once, Black Hollow's fear belonged not to the powerless, but to the powerful. The sheriff stumbled, shouting threats that no one heeded. The mayor's son paled, his arrogance crumbling as the crowd closed in, and in the middle of it all stood Mara, the nobody girl, her chin high, her voice strong. She was no longer invisible. She was the voice of Black Hollow, and the people. The deeper Mara and Elias dug, the more dangerous their nights became. Daylight was for playing their roles, Mara the obedient servant, Elias the harmless blind man, but when the sun dipped low and shadows swallowed the streets, they became something else, listeners, watchers, thieves of truth. Mara discovered quickly that darkness was her ally. Nobody noticed the girl carrying water through alleys or sweeping floors in the tavern late into the night. Men spoke too freely when they thought only a nobody was in the room. Women whispered their fears over laundry lines, believing no one was listening. But Mara was, always. And Elias was her guide. He taught her how to use silence as a weapon. Don't move unless you must, he told her as they crouched one night behind the mill. Most people reveal themselves if you give them enough quiet. They can't stand it. They'll fill the air with words, and in those words they'll betray themselves. So Mara learned to stay still, to breathe shallow, to press herself into corners, to become part of the shadows. She learned to let silence squeeze secrets out of liars. One night, she overheard two men behind the tavern. Their voices were low, their laughter cruel. Another shipment gone, and no one dares ask where it went, one bragged. Thanks to the sheriff's silence, the other answered. Gold flows in, and he keeps the law blind. Mara's stomach twisted. She repeated every word to Elias later, and though his expression remained calm, his grip on his walking stick nearly cracked the wood. Soon, stories spread in whispers across town. The butcher swore someone had been rifling through his ledgers. The priest muttered that unseen ears were catching his confessions. The mayor's men reported shadows that vanished when they gave chase. People began to speak of a ghost haunting Black Hollow, one that stalked the corrupt. Mara almost laughed when she heard it. A ghost. If only they knew it was a girl no one cared to look at, and a blind man no one thought capable. Yet the danger grew sharper with each secret uncovered. One evening, while eavesdropping outside the sheriff's office, Mara nearly stumbled into a trap. A guard lingered too long in the alley, pretending to smoke, waiting for whoever had been prying. Only Elias's warning saved her. He had been listening from across the street, his head cocked. "Footsteps," he whispered urgently when she returned. Too light for coincidence. They were waiting. It chilled her blood. The powerful were beginning to suspect. Still, she pressed on. She could not stop now. There was a night when Mara sat beside Elias, shivering under the stars, exhausted from a day of toil and a night of spying. "Why do you trust me?" she asked suddenly. "I'm nothing. Just a servant girl no one wants." Elias tilted his pale eyes toward her voice. "You're not nothing. You're unseen. There's a difference. One is weakness. The other is power." His words lodged deep in her chest. For the first time, she began to believe them. Perhaps her invisibility wasn't a curse but a gift. Together, they began to map the corruption like a web: names, dates, places, connections. Each truth was a knot tied tightly in their growing net. And though they still moved in the dark, they were no longer afraid of shadows. The shadows belonged to them now, but Black Hollow was stirring. The leaders, restless, whispered to each other of betrayal. The sheriff doubled his patrols. The mayor locked his books away. Even the priest warned of sinners in the dark. The storm was coming. Mara could feel it in her bones. And though she trembled, she also burned with a strange fire. She was no longer just the girl sweeping dust. She was the ghost in the dark, and the town was beginning to fear her. Black Hollow's nights grew heavier with each passing day, as though the town itself could sense a reckoning stirring beneath its crooked roofs. Mara and Elias had become creatures of those nights' two shadows, moving among many, but in the silence between danger and discovery, something else began to take root. Something softer, something neither of them had expected. It began in small ways. One evening, Mara returned from an errand, her arms raw from carrying sacks of grain. Elias sat waiting outside the inn, head tilted toward her approaching steps. "You're limping," he said, though she had said nothing. "I'm fine," she lied. "Your breath says otherwise. Sit," when she obeyed. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air until she guided it to her wrist. His fingers brushed lightly over the raw skin, tracing the blisters. Mara's breath caught. No one had ever touched her so gently before. No one had noticed her pain. "You shouldn't have to carry so much alone," he murmured. The words struck deeper than he knew. She had been carrying weight all her life, of grief, of loneliness, of invisibility. And here was this blind man who saw none of her scars, yet somehow understood them all. Their bond grew in the quiet moments between their secret work. Mara found herself lingering when she should have hurried away. She liked the way Elias spoke, slow and deliberate, as if every word mattered. She liked how he listened to her, truly listened, as though her thoughts held worth. One night, after escaping a near brush with discovery near the sheriff's office, they hid together in a narrow alley, their backs pressed against cold brick. Mara's heart pounded so loudly she feared it would give them away. Elias leaned close, his voice steady though hushed. "Do not be afraid. Fear makes them stronger." She swallowed hard. "I can't help it. My whole life I've been afraid." He turned his face toward her, his pale eyes soft. "And yet you walk into danger for truth. That makes you braver than anyone in this town." Mara felt heat rise in her chest, a mixture of pride and something she couldn't name. She was no longer invisible to him. He saw her not with his eyes, but with something deeper, one evening under the stars, she dared to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Do you ever wish you could see?" She whispered. Elias tilted his head back, listening to the night. "Once, yes. When I was younger, I thought sight was everything. But now, I see in ways others can't. I see what people hide. I hear what they try to silence. And when I listen to you, Mara, I see more clearly than I ever did with eyes." Her breath trembled. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not with pity, not with dismissal, but with truth that lifted her. She blinked hard, fighting tears. "Why me?" She whispered. "Why choose me of all people?" His voice was quiet, but it wrapped around her like warmth. "Because you are the one person who doesn't need to be someone else to matter. You're enough. Just as you are." The words broke something open inside her. For years she had lived as a shadow, believing herself unworthy of being seen, of being loved. And here, in the dark, Elias had turned her invisibility into strength, her loneliness into connection. As their alliance deepened, so did their hearts. What had begun as necessity became something neither could deny. Amid the danger, amid the lies and whispers, love was forming in the shadows' quiet. Fierce and unshakable. It was dangerous to feel this way, Mara knew. But for the first time in her life, she no longer felt alone. Together, she and Elias were more than two forgotten souls. Together, they were becoming something powerful enough to change. The following days in Black Hollow passed with the same bleak rhythm as always, merchants counting their coins, wives haggling over bread, children darting in and out of alleys where shadows lingered too long. Yet something had shifted. The stranger's arrival was like a stone thrown into still water. People kept glancing over their shoulders, speaking more quietly in the marketplace, locking doors that had always stood open. Mara noticed. She noticed everything. And she noticed him always calm, always listening. He walked the town's narrow streets with his stick, counting steps and turns, never once faltering. If anyone tried to mock him, he answered with silence so steady it unsettled them. Mara found herself watching, too often for her own good. One evening, she saw him sitting alone on the bench outside the inn, his head tilted toward the sky as if the sounds of night spoke to him more clearly than daylight ever could. Her chores were finished, but instead of heading home, her feet carried her toward him. "You move like you can see," she said. Before she could stop herself, he turned his head toward her, voice, a small smile forming. "And you watch like no one else does." Her cheeks warmed. "I'm nobody. People don't notice me." "Exactly." His smile deepened, not in mockery, but in understanding. "That's why you notice everything." Mara's breath caught. She had never heard anyone speak the truth of her so plainly. He tapped the bench beside him. "Sit." For the first time in her life, she hesitated, not from fear, but from the strangeness of being invited. She sat. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with thought. Finally, he said, "This town has rot in its bones. Do you feel it?" She nodded before she could think better of it. "Everyone knows. But no one says anything. If you do, you disappear. And yet you keep your eyes open." His voice was soft, but it carried weight. "You remember what others ignore. That makes you dangerous." Her heart pounded. Dangerous? She had spent her whole life trying not to be noticed, trying to survive by being small. And here was this blind man, telling her the very thing she thought of as weakness might be power. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. He tilted his face toward the sound of distant church bells. "Because lies have ruled this place too long. Someone has to see the truth, even if I have no eyes." Mara shivered. His words were dangerous, but they lit something inside her she hadn't felt before. Hope. He turned toward her, his pale eyes steady though they couldn't truly see. "I can't do this alone." I need someone who can move unseen. Someone they've already forgotten. The weight of his meaning settled over her. He was asking her to step into shadows deeper than she had ever dared. If she agreed, she would risk everything, her meager safety, her fragile place in this cruel world. But as she looked at him, she saw not pity, not scorn, but respect. Respect she had never been given before. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because you're the only one they don't see coming," he said simply. A long silence followed. In the distance, a dog barked. A door slammed. The town carried on in ignorance of what was being born between a blind man and a forgotten girl. Finally, Mara lifted her chin. "All right, I'll help you." He smiled, faint but real. "Then we begin." And just like that, an alliance formed in the shadows of Black Hollow, one that would change the town forever. The days that followed turned Mara's quiet, unnoticed life into something entirely different. She was still scrubbing steps, fetching water, and running errands, but now her ears were tuned, her eyes sharper. Every insult, every whisper, every careless word spilled in her presence became a thread she gathered. She realized quickly that the town was a loom of deceit, and its richest families were the weavers. The blind man who told her his name was Elias taught her how to listen differently. "Don't just hear the words," he said one evening as they sat behind the inn where no one would notice them. "Listen to what they don't say, to the pauses, to the lies they hide in silence," Mara tried. And to her surprise, she was good at it. When the mayor's wife scolded her for sweeping too slowly, Mara noticed how her hands trembled as she adjusted her ring too heavy with diamonds for a small-town leader's wife. When the sheriff ordered her to deliver a package to the mill after dark, she caught the sour stench of whiskey and something sharper, something that made her head spin even from the sealed jar. Piece by piece, the threads began to form a picture. The town's wealth was not earned, it was stolen. Smuggling ran through Black Hollow like veins of poison. The sheriff turned a blind eye to crimes as long as he was paid. The mayor's family profited from lost shipments that disappeared before reaching neighboring towns. Even the church, which preached humility on Sundays, received donations far larger than any farmer could afford, its priest conveniently silent on the corruption around him. Elias listened to every detail Mara brought him. His pale eyes never flickered, but his jaw would tighten, his fingers gripping his walking stick until his knuckles whitened. "They've built their power on lies," he said once. But lies are fragile things. All it takes is one truth placed where everyone can see it. Mara began to feel a strange exhilaration. She, the girl no one noticed, was slipping into places where truth lay hidden. She overheard deals struck in hushed voices while sweeping corners. She carried messages the rich assumed she couldn't read, but she memorized every word. They didn't see her. They never had. And that invisibility became her greatest strength. One evening, she sneaked into the back of the mayor's office under the pretense of cleaning. On the desk, left carelessly unguarded, was a ledger. She didn't know numbers well, but she knew enough to see patterns, large sums vanishing. Shipments recorded but never delivered. She didn't dare take it, but she memorized the names and dates before slipping out. When she told Elias, he smiled not with joy, but with grim certainty. "You're braver than you know," he said softly. She shook her head. "I'm terrified every second. That's what courage is," he replied. Fear carried anyway. The alliance between them deepened. What had started as unlikely companionship became partnership, each relying on the other's strengths. Elias's blindness was no weakness. He heard what others missed, read tones Mara never would have noticed. And Mara's invisibility gave her entry into places Elias could not go. Together, they pulled at the threads until the whole town's fabric began to unravel before them. But secrets are never uncovered quietly. The powerful sensed a shift. Whispers of betrayal crept through Black Hollow. Someone somewhere was prying too close, and while the townsfolk remained silent, the leaders began to tighten their grip. Orders became harsher, punishments swifter. It was as though the town itself knew two unseen hands were tugging at its lies, and soon the web would either collapse or stretch. The town of Black Hollow lay under a sky that always seemed heavy with smoke. Its streets, though cobblestoned, were cracked and uneven, like the very foundation of the place was giving way. The people who lived there wore the same look, eyes cast down, mouths shut tight, as if they carried secrets too dangerous to speak. Behind the facades of clean shop fronts and orderly homes lurked a rot that everyone felt but no one dared name. The rich families ran everything, and their power was built not on respect, but on fear. On a gray morning, when mist clung to the earth and the market had just begun to stir, a stranger walked into town. He carried no horse, no cart, no companion. Just a walking stick that tapped lightly against the ground, steady and measured. His eyes were pale, unfocused, sightless. People stopped what they were doing to stare. A blind man, alone, traveling into this town? It didn't make sense. The butcher muttered that the man must be mad. The baker's wife whispered that he wouldn't last a week here. But there was something about him that unsettled them. He didn't move like someone broken or pitiful. He walked with his chin high, step sure, as if blindness wasn't a weakness but a shield. He paused in the square, listening. The hum of voices, the shuffle of feet, the ring of a hammer on iron, all of it seemed to feed him. He tilted his head as if every sound painted a picture the townsfolk couldn't see. Though no words passed his lips, the silence he carried pressed against the square like a weight. The sheriff, a man with a belly as heavy as his pockets, narrowed his eyes from the steps of the courthouse. Strangers made him uneasy, especially ones who didn't flinch under his stare. He spat on the ground, muttering, "Blind fool won't last the night." But the blind man stayed. He asked for no charity, sought no pity. He rented a corner room at the inn with money that looked too clean to belong here. The innkeeper's wife, curious, offered to guide him up the narrow staircase, but he declined politely, counting the steps himself. She watched him disappear into the darkened hallway and shivered. Though she couldn't say why. By evening, the town was buzzing with whispers. Some claimed he was a beggar with coins stolen from pitying souls. Others insisted he was cursed, sent by God to punish them. A few wondered if he might be a holy man in disguise, come to unearth sins buried too deep. Whatever the guesses, no one liked the feeling he brought with him like the air before a storm. Yet, as the blind man settled into his room, he smiled faintly. He had heard enough in a single day to know the heart of this place was rotting. The town thought him helpless, harmless, but they had no idea. His blindness didn't make him weak. It made him watch differently, listen harder, sense the lies no one else bothered to question. And somewhere in that same town, sweeping the floors of a shop no one noticed, a girl was watching him too. She, like the stranger, lived in shadows unseen, unvalued, forgotten. She didn't yet know that this man's arrival would change her fate forever, or that together they would crack open the town's darkest secrets. For now, the town only saw a blind stranger. But Black Hollow would soon learn, sight isn't the only way to see. Her name was Mara, though most people never bothered to use it. To the townsfolk of Black Hollow, she was simply that girl, the one scrubbing steps outside the general store, the one carrying heavy baskets that weren't hers, the one running errands no one else wanted to do. She was small, thin, her clothes patched and faded from too many years of wear. To look at her once was to forget her twice. She had grown used to being invisible. Mara's parents had died when she was young, leaving her in the care of an uncle who drank more than he worked. By the time she was 10, she had learned to fend for herself. She worked for scraps cleaning floors, hauling water, mending torn clothes. The people she served never said thank you. If she did her work well, she was ignored. If she faltered, she was scolded. And always, always she was reminded of her place. "Lucky you have hands to work," the shopkeeper's wife told her once. "Else you'd starve. Invisible, unwanted, a nobody." Mara had swallowed these words so often they seemed part of her blood. Yet for all her smallness, she carried a sharpness inside like a blade hidden in rags. She noticed things. When the mayor's son passed coins under the table to the sheriff, she saw. When the baker raised prices only for widows and orphans, she remembered. No one asked her opinion, but she collected truths like other girls collected ribbons. On the morning the blind stranger arrived, Mara was sweeping dust from the store steps. She heard the low murmur of voices change, ripple through the crowd. People stopped what they were doing. She glanced up and saw him, tall walking stick in hand, eyes pale and sightless. For a moment, she almost pitied him. But then she noticed the way he moved steady, unshaken, as if the ground bent itself to him. The others whispered cruelly. Mara stayed silent. She knew what it was to be looked at as less than human. Still, she couldn't look away. That evening, as she carried a pail of water past the inn, she saw him again. He stood outside, his head tilted slightly, listening to the laughter and footsteps spilling from the tavern. His face was calm, but there was something searching in his stillness, as though he heard more than anyone else. Without thinking, Mara slowed her steps. "You're staring." His voice was low, but steadied out. Her heart jumped. "How did you know?" She blurted, then bit her lip, embarrassed. He smiled faintly. "I hear things most people don't." She didn't know what to say. People rarely spoke to her, and never like this. Noticing her discomfort, he turned his face toward her. "What's your name?" For a moment, she hesitated. "So few ever asked?" "Mara," she said softly. "Mara," he repeated, as if the name meant something. He didn't say girl or servant. He said Mara. It startled her more than anything else could have. Their conversation was brief, cut short by the innkeeper's shout for him to come inside. Mara hurried away, but her heart carried a warmth it had never felt before. Someone had seen her. Not for what she did, not for the work she carried, but for who she was. That night, lying on her straw mattress, Mara thought of the blind stranger. Everyone else dismissed him as helpless, doomed to fail in this cruel town. But she wasn't so sure. She sensed something in him, strength hidden behind silence, purpose behind stillness. And deep inside, a spark flickered. Perhaps, just perhaps, her invisibility could become her weapon. If no one saw her, she could go where others couldn't. She could hear what others ignored. She could be useful more than useful. The stranger didn't know it yet. Neither did she. But the girl nobody wanted had just taken her first step toward becoming the one person